Tonight on Nova, singer Arlo Guthrie, geneticist Nancy Wexler, and homemaker Janice Blenkharn all face a 50-50 chance of getting a fatal hereditary sickness which slowly destroys both body and mind. Now, thanks partly to Nancy's research, Janice will make a fearful choice: whether to look into a scientific crystal ball, peer into the future, and see her fate. Confronting the killer gene.
Funding for NOVA is provided by Prime Computer, supplying integrated computer solutions to the world's manufacturing, commercial, technical, and scientific marketplaces. And the Johnson & Johnson family of companies, supplying healthcare products worldwide. Major funding for NOVA is provided by this station and other public television stations nationwide.
This land is your land, and this land is my land.
Woody Guthrie was one of the greatest songwriters America has ever known. During the Depression and World War II, Americans saw themselves and their country in Woody's songs. But this program is not about Woody Guthrie's music. It's about the way he died. At the age of 33, while serving and singing in the Merchant Marines, Woody Guthrie felt the first faint symptoms of a fatal hereditary brain disorder which slowly destroys both body and mind. Woody had a young family when the illness called Huntington's disease entered his life. At first, he said it felt like being drunk. Then he got clumsy, and he had fits of temper and depression. Very slowly, he got worse. Finally, he landed in the hospital.
I was about 6 or 7 when he went into hospital. I mean, our life consisted of going to nursery schools and then regular grammar schools and then going to visit our dad at the hospital on the weekends. That's just the way we grew up. And over the years, he got worse in terms of his ability to walk or his ability to communicate or something like that. But it was very slow and very gradual. And I don't ever recall ever sort of noticing it. I mean, I could understand it somehow intuitively, but I wasn't old enough to appreciate what was really wrong with him or what was going on. That's just the way our life was.
Eventually, Woody couldn't play his guitar anymore, couldn't even speak. It took 22 years for Woody Guthrie to die of Huntington's. There was nothing that medicine could do to help him. And each of his children had a 50% chance of dying the same way.
I don't ever remember feeling like a sudden, wow, that could happen to me, or anything like that. I just took it for granted, just like, everybody eventually understands that they're going to grow old and die, but there's not many kids who are walking around thinking about it. I wasn't thinking about Huntington's disease either, because my dad seemed to be a lot older than me. All of those things, it never even occurred to me as a kid that I should worry about it.
They thought the world had ended. They thought it was their doom.
Like his father, Arlo Guthrie is a musician and songwriter. He may also have inherited his father's fatal illness. Huntington's is a genetic disease. It's caused by a mutation, a mistake in a single gene. Everyone who inherits the mutated gene will get the disease. About 25,000 Americans have Huntington's disease. 125,000 more have a risk of getting it. Usually it strikes people in their 30s and 40s, but there have been cases as young as 2 and as old as 82. So Arlo doesn't yet know what's in store for him.
It covered up our tractors in this wild and dusty storm.
Maureen Kent was diagnosed with Huntington's disease 2 years ago. It is already affecting many aspects of her life.
Is everything okay, ladies?
Until recently, Maureen had a full-time job as a pediatric nurse and an active social life. She had always thought of herself as rather clumsy, and so didn't pay attention to the way she was increasingly dropping things and bumping into people. When Huntington's disease was diagnosed, Maureen had no idea that the disease was in her family. Perhaps the hardest blow for Maureen was having to leave work and the children she'd cared for. Fortunately, she's been able to continue part-time in a daycare center.
Well, I was very depressed for months. It was about 8 months until I could actually not think about it all day, every day. But I had lots and lots of people who helped me all the time. Like I saw a social worker every 2 weeks, and the people at my church were all very helpful, and the people I worked with used to back me up so much. I could talk to them at any time, and they were all very, very helpful. It took a long time until I could actually not think about it all day long. And it was so depressing, I couldn't go out or do things, and I didn't really want to talk to anybody else about it very much. I found it so hard to come to terms with it. I mean, now you have to look at life so differently, and all your priorities in life that you had before, like having children, and going out, having a life, or going abroad, all the things that you took, as priorities before, you have to look at it so differently now because life is so different in every way. I find it so hard to get around and things, but everything I do is so difficult now. You have to sort of think very carefully before you can actually do anything. Hello, Max.
At least Maureen was spared the agony of expectation. Her father died young of a heart attack before he could develop the symptoms of Huntington's disease. The shock of discovering the disease was felt by the whole family. Now that Maureen has Huntington's, her sister Carol knows she too may be carrying the mutated gene.
What happened in the crash this morning? Oh, it's lovely. It has some lovely little children, and they're so sweet, and they keep sort of playing with me and cuddling, all that sort of thing. It's really lovely.
When Huntington strikes, the circle of victims goes far beyond those who are actually sick. Janice Blenkharn of Manchester, England, shows no symptoms of Huntington's disease, but she has already suffered greatly. The disease devastated her family when she was growing up. Her mother died of Huntington's, and it destroyed her father's life as well.
Because my father, he drank a lot through the stress of having 6 children and a wife with Huntington's chorea. So all his love, he just give up the will to cope. So I believe Huntington's chorea killed both my parents because he died of cirrhosis of the liver through a drink.
Janice now faces the most difficult decision of her life. A test has been developed which can tell her whether she has inherited the Huntington's gene. Doctors can show her her own future, if she chooses to see it. This new genetic test was made possible by years of difficult research carried out thousands of miles away in villages around Lake Maracaibo, Venezuela. Lagunetas is a small fishing community on the lake where Huntington's disease is part of everyday life. Here, 1 in 5 will develop the disease and die from it. In Lagunetas, the disease can be traced back to a woman who lived here over a century ago. Intermarriage among her descendants has led to the greatest concentration of Huntington's anywhere in the world. For the past few years, an American research team has been studying this Venezuelan family and painstakingly piecing together their family tree. The team is led by geneticist Nancy Wexler. It was more than a professional interest in Huntington's disease that brought Nancy to Venezuela. 10 years ago, her mother died from the disease. Nancy now has a 50% chance of becoming a sufferer herself. Her mother was 53 when she was diagnosed, much older than most Huntington's victims. She thought she had escaped.
She was a very meticulous woman, very well dressed. She was always very proud of how she kept herself, never drank particularly, and was also very proud of doing this jury duty and going down and having civic duty. So she was walking across the street, 8 o'clock in the morning, and a policeman stopped her in the middle of the street and said to her, "Aren't you ashamed of yourself to be drunk at this hour in the morning?" And for my mother, this was a death sentence. I mean, she was terrified, and she also knew what it meant, that she in fact did have Huntington's disease. In 1967, when this diagnosis was made, my father felt that he wanted desperately to try to find something. He wanted, first of all, to find something for her, and if it couldn't be done that fast, he wanted to find something for my sister and myself. I was 21, and she's 3 years older than I. So he began what later became the Hereditary Disease Foundation.
The foundation soon learned of the unique concentration of the disease in Venezuela.
I actually had first heard about Venezuela in the early 70s at a meeting at the World Federation of Neurology when some Venezuelan scientists had come and showed us a film of the families here in San Luis. And we were intrigued by this community where there was so much Huntington's disease and where the patients lived at home with their families.
The disease is often called Huntington's chorea. Chorea means jerky, dance-like movements of the limbs. In Huntington's, these movements are produced by damage to a small region deep inside the brain. Expedition to Venezuela to try to track down the key members of the Huntington's family.
When I first came down and we began to work, it was right after my mother had died. And that it was very... I think that the hereditary aspect of it is also the most appalling to families. We know there are 1,000 people who are at risk. There are probably 300 people who will die in the next couple of decades.
Nancy and her team found many of the Huntington's victims in the little barrio of San Luis, but she was told that another larger branch of the same family lived in an isolated fishing village on the far side of the lake.
It was like entering some magical village. Not that it was so pretty, the people are very poor, but they've built houses out of tin or wood, and they're built on stilts over the water. And there's about 21 little houses, a little store, and a little church. And each house can have up to 18 or 20 people living in those houses. And then we found a very large family down there. Many brothers and sisters who were affected, families that were very big, 14 children, 13 children, who were all cousins of each other. And so we got on the plane the next day totally exhausted, but with this feeling that if the genetic search could ever crack this disease, this was the family to study.
Nancy went to Venezuela hoping to find a cure or a treatment for Huntington's disease. Her first step would be locating the defective gene and finding out what it does. If she could figure out what was causing the damage, perhaps she could find a way to stop it.
We knew that if we took certain steps, there was a chance of finding the gene. And if we could find the gene, we could find the mistake. And if we could find the mistake, maybe we could fix it, or change it, or prevent it.
But to do that, scientists first need to draw the family trees of large numbers of victims. It was an exhausting task. The researchers had to work out how all the family members were related to each other and which ones had come down with the disease.
So what we began doing is making a pedigree and taking Polaroid pictures of people, and we would put them next to their names on the pedigree. When people came into the room, we didn't know who they were, we would just say, look on the pedigree and point to your nearest relative, and then we could kind of establish who they were. Sometimes, because we were, so novel, the rooms would be just packed, hundreds of people, and no air conditioning. It'd be like a sauna bath, and we couldn't even talk to each other. So you have to stand on a chair and scream over the tops of the heads of all these people. did you know who this person is? You know, so it was completely a madhouse.
That early work proved invaluable. Since 1981, the research team has mapped out the relationships of nearly 10,000 members of the Venezuelan family.
Yo, dirimo, giorni, Gelisa, yo, dirimo, giorni, Gelisa y giorni.
The family tree is so big it now covers 3 whole walls of the clinic. But working out the family tree was just the beginning. The researchers needed genetic material from as many family members as possible, and that required drawing hundreds of blood samples.
I think one of the hardest things was trying. They were sick. In very broken Spanish, I tried to explain to them that we needed to study complete families, and that this was the biggest family with Huntington's disease that we'd ever found in the world anywhere. I also told them that this was a disease that was in the United States, which they had never known. They just thought this was a Venezuelan disease in their town, in their family. And they were astonished to find out that this disease was in the United States. And they said to me, but you know, you can put people on the moon. Why can't you cure this disease? You know, why do you put up with it? You know, I mean, it's like, you know, we have to, but you don't. And then when I told them that my mother had this disease, they were just completely dumbstruck. And I told them that, you know, way back, you know, very far back, that we shared the same blood, that we were family also. And I think that they felt that I knew what it was like. And I think that the difference that it's made is that if I would put myself out to try to do this research, then I must believe in it. And if I believed in it, even if it was totally crazy, that they would go along with it. But for many people, particularly for the men here, they believe that if you take their blood, you're taking their vital bodily fluid, and that if they give blood, that they can't drink, that they can't go fishing, that they can't make love, and very often they'll say, I don't want to give blood. I'm scared to give blood. And the thing that persuades them is their children. I mean, if you really explain to them what you're doing and you say, you know, you have a big family and they know that their children are at risk and that this is for the future of their children, for the health of their children, that'll do it. Most of the time.
Year after year, the precious blood samples were packed up carefully and flown to Boston. There they were met by a member of a laboratory team at Massachusetts General Hospital. This lab was headed by Dr. Jim Guzella, a pioneer in using new techniques to study DNA, the material which makes up our genes. His goal, like Nancy's, was to find the Huntington's gene. If he could do that, he hoped to force the gene to give up its secret and reveal how it kills brain cells.
When we first began the search for the Huntington's gene, I think most people felt it would take many years to find it. Recombinant DNA technology came along, and that's the technology that really allowed you to look directly at DNA sequence differences and to look at the vast majority of regions of chromosomes that you hadn't been able to test before. And so it really was an emerging technology that had to be applied to the problem, and it took a few years for people to realize exactly how powerful it was.
DNA is a long spiral ladder with its genetic information in the pattern of steps. Human DNA has 3 billion steps, altogether 100,000 genes. It's found in our cells, divided into 23 chromosome pairs. In all this genetic material, where is the Huntington's gene? Someday it may be possible to compare complete DNA ladders rung by rung for people who have a disease and people who don't, and find the problem gene directly. Today's techniques are not nearly good enough for that. But Jim thought the new technology could be used first to identify the general region where the gene was hiding, and then to zero in on it. It was a strategy that had never been used before, but it ought to work.
I'll be doing that.
Okay.
Jim's plan was to take advantage of a natural process called chromosome crossover, which happens when the body makes egg or sperm cells. In most cells, chromosomes come in pairs. For each gene on one chromosome, there is a corresponding gene on the other. In Huntington's disease, the parent normally has only one disease gene. The corresponding gene on the other chromosome is healthy, but the Huntington's gene is dominant. When the body makes an egg or a sperm, something very strange happens to the chromosomes. First, the two members of each pair twist around each other, break, and swap large chunks of DNA. Then they separate. The two new chromosomes are mixtures, with pieces from each of the old chromosomes. Next, the cell divides. One chromosome from each pair goes into each sperm or egg. So the sperm or egg winds up with just half of the parent's DNA. That's why children have only a 50% chance of inheriting Huntington's disease. Jim intended to use this chromosome mixing process to find the approximate location of the gene. He knew that a DNA segment far from the gene would stand a good chance of being separated during crossover, so that a child could inherit that segment and not get the disease. But a segment of DNA that was close to the gene would usually stay with it through crossover and be passed on to a child along with the disease. So if Jim could isolate a DNA segment that was inherited along with the disease, he would know it must be close to the disease gene.
The frequency with which two genes are going to be exchanged with each other is going to depend on how far apart they are. If they're very close together, the chance of an exchange event occurring in between them, the chance of a crossover, is quite small. If they're at opposite ends of the chromosome, the chance is quite high. So what we do is we look for inherited differences between people that show a very high correlation with the inheritance of the disease.
The new recombinant DNA techniques make it possible to locate tiny segments of DNA, so each one can be checked to see if it's near the disease gene. The process of detecting them starts with a sample of DNA from each member of a family. Each sample is mixed with a chemical called a restriction enzyme, which cuts DNA every time it finds a specific, very short pattern of rungs on the DNA ladder. Each person's DNA is unique, so the short patterns cut by the restriction enzymes are in different places.
So you generate from a person's DNA about 1 million fragments with a given restriction enzyme, and those fragments are going to be the same for that person forever, but another person is going to be slightly different. And what we have to do is detect those differences.
The next step is to sort and separate the DNA fragments by size, and that's done with electricity. First, each person's cut-up DNA is injected into a separate hole in a gel.
So we then take the DNA, we put it on an agarose gel, which is a semi-solid medium that just supports the DNA, turn on an electric current. The DNA, which is negatively charged, travels through the gel towards the positive pole, with the smaller fragments sieving through faster than the bigger fragments. The result is that the DNA fragments are spread out by size, with the smallest at the bottom and the largest at the top of the gel.
Now the pieces are all spread out in the gel, but they're still invisible. The key to making them visible is radioactivity. The pieces of DNA are absorbed onto filter paper to hold them in place. Working behind a protective screen, a lab worker puts a radioactive fluid into a plastic bag with the filter paper. The fluid acts as a tag. It's made so it will stick to 1 or 2 small pieces of DNA, but leave the others alone. X-ray film is put over the filter paper to detect the radioactivity. When the film is developed, it shows exactly where on the filter paper the tag found something to stick to. Each dark band on the developed film shows the presence of a specific tiny segment of DNA. These segments are passed on from parent to child. By running the whole procedure with DNA from several family members, the research team could follow the inheritance of each segment, looking for a segment inherited with Huntington's disease. Since they were checking DNA segments at random, the search could have taken decades, but the team got lucky. In their very first batch of 15 bands checked, one band seemed to be passed from parent to child along with the sickness. That suggested they had found a DNA segment close enough to the Huntington's gene to stay with the gene through crossover. If so, the band could be used as a marker, a signpost to help them find the gene. But they needed to check more cases to be sure that their findings weren't just a coincidence.
When we had a hint, in the beginning it was about 50-50, and it took about a month of work on some Venezuelans to move those odds up to about 80-20, and at that point I was pretty convinced, but knew that we had to get to well over 99-1 to really prove it to everyone else. That took another couple of months, and then I was extremely happy that my initial hint had turned out to be true.
For me, it was the absolutely happiest moment of my life. I mean, it was just total ecstasy. I was kind of totally on the ceiling. I was jumping up and down. I don't think any of us could believe it. I think for a lot of reasons. I mean, certainly one of the most important to me was that there had been this major breakthrough. I mean, nobody could believe it, because when we came down here in the beginning, very sophisticated scientific people said, look, this is hopeless. You're going to stockpile an awful lot of samples. Nobody's going to use them. If it works, it's going to take 50 years, 70 years. You know, and we used to come down here, and I would think after a day, you know, that I was putting people through all kinds of torture. We're never going to get anywhere.
With another long and complex series of tests, Guthrie and his team traced the marker to the tip of chromosome 4 close. Here's how they knew. Everyone has 2 versions of the marker, one on each chromosome. What the Boston team found was that when a Huntington's gene is on a chromosome with, say, the green marker, then any child who inherits the green marker has a 95% chance of getting the fatal gene along with it. But 5% of the time, the crossover process breaks the chromosome between the Huntington's gene and the marker. In that case, a child could get the green marker without getting the disease. The 5% chance told the scientists that the marker must be only 5 million steps away from the disease gene on the DNA ladder. That may not sound close, but it meant that the search for the gene could be restricted to just 0.03% of human DNA. It was a real breakthrough. Meanwhile, the marker could be used immediately as a predictive test, a scientific crystal ball which could tell many children of Huntington's victims with up to 95% accuracy whether or not they had inherited the disease. Using this crystal ball can involve some complicated detective work.
What we have here is an example of typing a family with the original marker to determine which children of an affected father inherited the Huntington's gene. The DNA from the affected father is run in this lane and typed with the probe, and the probe detects 2 different fragments. One fragment comes from the normal chromosome 4, and one comes from the chromosome 4 that has the Huntington's disease gene. So the first thing we have to do in this family is find out which of those 2 patterns is on the chromosome that has the Huntington's gene. We do that by typing DNA in this adjacent lane here from his unaffected mother. His unaffected mother has only the upper band. She therefore had to pass that upper band on to him, and his lower band must have come from his affected father. It therefore is the band that travels with the Huntington's gene. His wife, shown in this lane, has both normal chromosomes with the lower band. Notice that it's the same lower band present in him. In his case, it travels with Huntington's disease. In her case, it's associated with a normal chromosome, and that's because this is just a normal variation in the population. It's not diagnostic in itself of Huntington's disease. However, because she has only the lower band, we know that all of her children will receive a lower band from her. The question then is, what do those children receive from their affected father? If they receive the upper band, then they don't get the Huntington's gene. They get the normal chromosome 4, and they'll be fine. If they get this lower band from him, they will have Huntington's disease because they've inherited the Huntington's gene. We've typed 4 of his children over here. Each of them, of course, received the lower band from their mother, and 3 of them, fortunately, have received the upper band from the father. The upper band goes with the normal chromosome 4. These 3 children will not have Huntington's disease. This child, however, has received the lower band from the mother and from the father, and therefore this child has received the Huntington's disease chromosome and will eventually show symptoms of Huntington's disease.
For now, the Venezuelans are not being told who is likely to get the disease. But several genetic clinics have begun very cautiously to offer the test to children of other Huntington's victims. One of those who could have the new test is Nancy Wexler herself. Does she want to learn her fate?
I think that the predictive test is a very mixed blessing. And the more I think about it, the more mixed it becomes. I started thinking, well, really, how much happier would I be knowing that I'm free of this illness now than I am right now? And that's when I began to think, well, I'm really actually pretty happy right now. And of course I would be ecstatic not to have the disease, but is it that much more happy? And how would I feel if somebody really told me that I have Huntington's disease? And so then I began to feel, well, I would be more distressed knowing that I had HD. It would be a greater distress to know that I had it than there would be happiness to know I was free of it. But in terms of my living now, I think what's been valuable, both being at risk and also thinking about the test, is that I've tried to live as if I were going to be healthy. I think that, for example, going to school, people say to me, I want to take this test because I really want to be a lawyer, but why bother to be a lawyer, if I'm going to get this disease? And my feeling is, go be a lawyer. You don't know when you're going to get sick. You could get sick at 82. So what are you going to do? You're going to cancel out now, decide to be a patient, give up the rest of your life, live in boredom, don't develop your mind, and for what? Many Huntington's patients have had extremely productive lives until they become ill. Woody Guthrie gave us an entire repertoire of songs that people were singing all over the world. So, Bruce Springsteen, sings Woody Guthrie. Well, what would happen if Woody Guthrie had a predictive test at age 18 saying, I'm going to check out?
I've been having some hard traveling, I thought you knowed.
By the time Woody Guthrie died, he had written more than 1,000 songs, many of them familiar favorites, and he had 7 children. His son Arlo carried on Woody's tradition of social protest music. In 1967, Arlo became a star in his own right with a 20-minute song about littering and the Vietnam War. One day that summer, Arlo played the song for his father. 3 months later, Woody Guthrie died. Today, Arlo is still singing and still healthy. He feels the predictive test would make no sense for him.
I have learned to live every day without looking over my shoulder or without looking back. I do exactly what I'd be doing, whether I knew I had Huntington's or didn't have Huntington's. I'm right in the age when I'm supposed to be getting this stuff or something. And all I can tell you is that somehow or other, I have escaped the trauma. There's a lot of people out there with a lot of genetic disorders. There's a lot of people, the biggest genetic disorder of all is death. And everybody has that sort of programmed in them. So I'm not unlike everybody else that's walking around on this planet. The only difference is that I might leave it sooner than other people.
When he's not on a concert tour, Arlo lives on a farm in western Massachusetts with his wife and 4 children.
Life somehow is more important than worrying about diseases. I got my own kids, look at them. I could have said, well, I don't want to inflict pain and suffering. It's enough pain and suffering just having teenagers. You don't have to worry about Huntington's disease. You know what I'm saying? It's wonderful. Life is wonderful. There's a lot to live for.
If Arlo is carrying the gene, he will sooner or later get sick, and his children will have a 50% chance. If he is free of the gene, then they have no cause for concern, and Huntington's will have run its course in this family.
What are you doing to this poor son? You're massacring my tooth. Remember that, Lee?
In England, Janice Blenkharn has decided she does want the marker test, mostly for the sake of her two children, David and Christopher. She only found out 10 years ago that the disease which killed her mother was hereditary, that she and her children were at risk.
When I first found out, I was devastated. I think it was with having the children, because I felt so guilty. Not so much with the first, because I didn't understand, but with the second, I was 3 months pregnant, and I still went ahead and had the baby. So I have that in my mind, the guilt, because I could have had him terminated, and I just, through selfishness, I wanted to keep the child.
Why do you want to have a test?
Mainly for the boys. It's just I feel it's a chance I have to take for the boys, because of the guilt I have, especially with the second one. I feel if I do have that opportunity, I have to take it and then put them out of the misery of being at risk. Other than that, I think really if I'm told I'm going to get the disease, it would only be within a couple of years anyway, so I'm finding something out that might happen. You know, it's bound to happen sooner than later with our family history. But for the boys' sake, I would like to take the test.
The test, of course, isn't absolutely perfect. It can't tell you definitely yes or no, but
no.
There's a bit of possible error.
Better odds, though, isn't it, than 50-50? Far better odds.
Hello, hi, come on in.
Janice has asked to be among the first people tested at a Manchester clinic where she's been going for counselling for 6 years.
Dr. Crawford.
Hello.
Janice and Graham.
Hello.
How was your journey? Come a long way.
The clinic schedules a series of counselling sessions for Janice and Graham so they can talk through all the implications of the test.
And we put a lot to talk about this afternoon. We didn't want to try and sort out anything finally today, but really just to explore the possibilities and put you in the picture as to what could be done. Because you have a sister who has
Yeah, I have a sister with Huntington's screen. I have a sister who's died. Well, she was only 26 when she died.
Yes, so she started with it a little bit earlier.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sometimes you feel, well, every day you feel you've started and you watch everything you do, and if you drop something, it's because you've got Huntington's career, and I think you do come to terms with it.
It's the not knowing that's as destructive as anything, really.
Mm-hmm. And it's the guilt as well with having children. You know, I think if you're single, you can cope a lot better than knowing that you could pass the gene on to a child. You know, and now they're coming into their own, the little adults. You feel the guilt more. You know, when they were babies, not as much, but now the little people, you feel, what have I done, sort of thing.
Supposing we could do the test and it was to turn out that your risk came down a lot, perhaps to say 10%, something like that, what would that mean for you?
It would mean a lot. It would take a lot of pressure off. I mean, what you could get on with your life. You always feel something's going to hold you back. Whatever you do, you know, your work, you feel you can't carry on. You always think you're going to be stopped.
Yes. What sort of things do you think you might be able to do that you can't do at the moment?
Oh, drive. I would like to learn to drive. It's just that I won't do these things. I think everything's going to be a waste of time. And if I had a lesser risk, I would go ahead and do them.
But what about the practical consequences if the thing turned out to be not okay, if there was a high risk? How would it affect your life in a everyday practical sort of way?
Well, obviously it would affect it, but I would just, come to terms with it and try my best just put everything into the children. Because obviously they're going to go through being at risk that I've been through, and you do have your ups and downs, and well, if you can help them, it's something to put your life into. Although it won't be long, I could do a lot in that time. No, I can't really see it being any worse than it has been.
Possibly harder at first, but then...
No, I'd probably need a few weeks to come to terms with it, but it couldn't be any worse. Just couldn't, because that's how I've felt from being 22, is I'm not going to see 40. And you never get up sort of think, no, I haven't got Huntington's chorea. You get up think, oh my God, I've got it, it's every day. So it can only, nothing can be worse. The marriage, particularly, we've had a real rough marriage, which I think we could have avoided. But sometimes I feel it's made us stronger through having this, and other times I think we've wasted a lot of time through being depressed over Huntington's chorea.
Hi, Mel. Had a mix? Kind of mix, please. A bit of lemon malt, please.
Like in my mother's generation, they just accepted it, accepted all the trauma that went with it. But, we're different. Our generation are finding it difficult.
Cheers, Mel. Thanks for that.
I've been at the first counselling session. It's made me feel I'm nearer the truth. I'll know how to cope with my life and the children. And I just feel at last I can see a light at the end of the tunnel.
3 months later, the go-ahead was given for Janice's test to be performed. A sample of her blood was already available, but DNA would also be needed from other members of her family, both affected and unaffected, so the lab could determine which version of the marker is riding near the gene in this family. 11 members of Janice's family donated blood samples. The procedures needed to perform the test are the same as those used for finding the marker in the first place. The only important difference is that the lab knows which restriction enzyme and which radioactive tag to use. Normally, the whole process should take about a week. As it happened, technical difficulties caused 2 delays, and Janice waited for 3 weeks over the Christmas-New Year period while the laboratory worked to get a confirmed result. On Wednesday, the 14th of January, Janice and Graham returned to the hospital to hear the outcome.
I'm quite well. I'm looking forward to it. I'm just hoping it's not a result where there hasn't been enough news. And I'm ready for either way, but I'm a bit worried they haven't enough information.
Janice and Graham went in alone to get the results. The test was positive. Janice is very likely to get Huntington's disease. She did not want to be interviewed that day. But 2 weeks later, Janice wrote to say she had decided to continue with the filming of her story. She said, "I am sorry I took so long to write, but I have had such a lot to do in this past week. I've been home to see my family and they have taken my result very well. In fact, it has helped them a great deal. They feel they can cope better now." Does Janice have any regrets about taking the test?
None whatsoever. No regrets at all. I feel better. I know there's an whole team of people there to help me, and plus my husband knows, and he's accepted that he will need help. Well, before he felt it was something he would shoulder himself, there's people there to help him, and there's people there to help the children. And by the time my children are adult, there'll be even more things to offer them. So I'm quite content with the result. At first, my main worry at first, when I was first told, was how to tell people I felt I'd let people down. But myself, I was prepared for that result. And really, there's not a lot to change, because to me, it feels just the same as 50-50. But there's things I have to do, you know, what I didn't feel sure in doing before, because there was 50-50 risk. I felt with the children I was uncomfortable telling them things and preparing them for it if there was, you know, a low risk. But now I know it's high risk. I know it's a duty to do these things for the children. And I feel really lucky because I'm nearly 32, and if you go from the family, 24 has been the main age of onset. So for the first time in my life, I felt lucky because I've had these extra years. And plus, through doing this, I've been able to do something about it. I've done something in that time I've been given. You know, and none of the others have had that. But very early 20s, they've started, they haven't been able to enjoy the children. They haven't been able to cope with life because everything's come at once. Starting the house and everything. Well, I've had all that, so I feel lucky.
Janice's 2 children could be tested themselves when they are 18, considered old enough to make such an important decision. Perhaps by then, there will be some way to combat Huntington's. That's what they're hoping at Jim Guzela's lab in Boston and at other laboratories now working together, closing in on the Huntington's gene. They have already found new markers, much closer to the gene than the one which Janice was tested for.
With the availability of the newer markers, the genetic test under ideal circumstances now has greater than 99% accuracy, meaning that the information given to people is much clearer now, and there's not the 5% probability of error that there was with the original marker.
But the scientists are coming up against frustrating obstacles in the final stages of the hunt for the gene.
We wish that we had already cloned the Huntington's gene, but it's been very difficult to work on the particular region that contains it. It is very near to the tip of chromosome 4, and that makes it quite hard to isolate DNA sequences. It's very hard to predict how long it's going to take. I wouldn't have predicted it would take this long, so I assume that we will have it within a couple of years, but you really can't predict with certainty.
2 years may not seem so long, but finding the gene is just the first step. Then they will have to find out what the gene does to cause the disease.
The goal of finding the gene is to try and develop a therapy for the disorder, but whether you'll be able to do so or not depends totally on what the nature of that gene is. The reason for using this approach is that we don't know what the nature of the gene is. By isolating it and finding out what the defect is, it may turn out to be something that's easily treatable, or it may turn out to be something that there's no possible treatment with current technology. And there's really no way to know until we isolate that gene.
So for Janice, and even more for Maureen Kent, who already has the disease, there's only a very faint hope that help will come in time. In the past 6 months, Maureen's condition has gotten worse. Already, walking is becoming difficult. In March, Maureen's family celebrated her 33rd birthday.
Hello. Hello. Thank you. Hello. Oh.
It was very depressing at first. Obviously, I've come to terms with this. It's been 10 months since I've been able to get around. And I had to leave my flat because I couldn't manage anymore. all that sort of thing has been a bit distressing, but I've been living with my mother now for about 6 months. We get on very well. Obviously, at first it was difficult because neither of us have spent so much time together before. We get on very well, though, on the whole. And my tablets, I'm trying to take 2 tablets now because they said that would probably stop the twitching. And I'm trying to increase them, but they make me very sleepy for the first 3 days.
I love that noise. I really like that one. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Maurice. Happy birthday to you.
The party here is where you've sort of seen it. But it's been marvellous. Had some lovely presents. And I've had a really lovely time this year. It's been marvellous.
Way!
Yeah, I think obviously some days better than others. Everyone has a good and bad day, and everyone have days perhaps when they think the world doesn't look so quite as nice as they'd hope it would. But I don't look too much in the future. I think one thing that does depress me a bit sometimes is when Mum goes, what's going to happen, because Cal's got young children, and I'm only young at the moment. I'm only 30 after 33 today. But that worries me a bit. I often wonder what's going to happen in the future, perhaps when Mum can't manage anymore, because she's nearly 70 now. And at the moment, she manages all right because I don't need much help. I obviously have to help her to do my buttons up, dressing and undressing little thing, and doing bows like this bow. That's why she kept doing it up all evening. But it does worry me sometimes. On the whole, I just don't think about it too much.
If the predictive test had been available 10 years ago, would Maureen have taken it?
I don't know. I don't think so, really. Because, it's difficult because, I went through my whole life without knowing about it and had a very happy life, went abroad, did all the things that people normally do with their life. I think perhaps if I had known sooner, then you'd have that hanging over you. And just knowing that you could get it means that your whole outlook on life would be different, because I'd always had a very carefree sort of existence going out and doing things. I think it would be different. I don't think I could have coped with it, really. I don't think I would have had it done.
Does Maureen have any advice for people who have just been told they're going to get Huntington's?
Well, just don't. I was so depressed at first. You might think I've sort of come to terms with it, but I was so depressed at first. It was absolutely dreadful. I really thought the end of the world had come. But there is a future. It takes a long time, and everyone comes to terms with it in their own way. But it does happen eventually. They really do find one day they wake up and they don't think about it every day. As I used to, I used to wake up and think, and it was just so depressing. I had nothing else really in my life at that time. But new things always look up, and you always find something different.
And when I look to the future, I feel, as I've said, I feel lucky that I've got to near 32, and any year now, it'll be a bonus. And if it doesn't happen, but I'm quite prepared for it to happen. I'm not worried about it. And I feel, even with Huntington's career, right up until the very end, I feel I'll be able to cope and I'll be able to help. I'll be able to live, I'll be able to have fun. These things are available for people now, and with it being known about, you're not stared at and laughed at anymore. Life's different, so I can look to the future. For the first time, I'm not living on the past.
Funding for NOVA is provided by the Johnson & Johnson family of companies, supplying healthcare products worldwide, and Prime Computer, supplying integrated computer solutions to the world's manufacturing, commercial, technical, and scientific marketplaces. Major funding for NOVA is provided by this station and other public television stations nationwide. For a transcript of this program, send $5 to NOVA Transcripts, Box 322, Boston, Massachusetts 02134. Please be sure to include the show title.